Try to get my team member fired? Get deported instead. Here's how I turned the tables. So, buckle up, because this one's a doozy. I'm still not sure if this qualifies as pro-revenge, but trust me, the drama and spice in this one are top tier. I'll let you all be the judge. And if you think it's not quite pro-revenge, let me know and I'll take it to another sub. But damn, this was one hell of a ride. This is one of those stories where everything escalates so quickly that you don't realize how bad things are getting until it's too late. What starts as a simple office rivalry quickly turns into a game of high-stakes revenge, and the final twist is something you'll never expect. Back in the early 2010s, I had just landed a job with a pretty major internet company based in the UK. They were opening a shiny new office in London, and everything was fresh, exciting, and full of potential. The company was expanding, and I was tasked with leading the development department. I was in charge of overseeing everything from the ground up, building a solid team, leading web development projects, and executing high-level redesigns for some of the company's most important websites. The first few months were a whirlwind of getting things off the ground, hiring team members, and setting up processes. The energy was contagious, everyone was eager to get going, but the challenges were real. No one told me that navigating office politics and dealing with egos would be just as difficult as managing projects. But I was up for it. My career had been all about getting my hands dirty and making things happen, and I was determined to show everyone that I could handle the responsibility. But let me tell you, things weren't as shiny as they seemed. When I walked into the office, there were only 3 key people in charge: the office manager, a content team lead, and the SEO team lead. It was clear from the start that the office had potential, but also a lot of friction. I was recruited after interviews with both the office manager and the SEO team lead, Andy. Andy seemed like the kind of guy who had all the answers, especially when it came to SEO. But as soon as I started working with him, I realized something wasn't right. In theory, we should have been collaborating, but Andy had this habit of stepping on my toes when it came to the development side. Whenever I presented a solution or suggestion that didn't fit his idea of what was best, he would push back hard, like I was doing something wrong, and make it seem like I didn't know what I was talking about. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just a minor difference in approach, but soon enough, I realized it was more personal than that. He wasn't just disagreeing with me, he was challenging me, questioning my every decision. And the worst part? He started undermining me behind my back. He'd go straight to the office manager with complaints and try to make me look like I was incompetent. I didn't back down, though. I stood my ground, explaining the logic behind my approach and why my way would be better for the team and the project. But every time I stood my ground, it felt like I was setting off a bomb. The tension between us grew, and I started noticing that Andy was not only upset with me professionally, but seemed to have a personal vendetta. He thought I was challenging his authority. He didn't like that I wasn't just following his instructions. He expected me to be a yes man, to just agree with whatever he said, even when it didn't make sense. And that, I couldn't do. By this point, I knew something was off with Andy. The guy expected me to be a yes man. He thought that because I was new, I'd just bow to his demands and let him push me around. But that's not me. I wasn't about to let anyone walk all over me, especially not when it came to my team. I had experience and expertise in web development that Andy didn't have. I knew my field inside out, and I wasn't about to let anyone, especially someone with no real development experience, undermine my authority. I'd seen this kind of behavior before in other jobs, where people try to exert power by bullying their way through situations. But I wasn't that easy to push around. Every time Andy tried to pull rank, I'd calmly explain why my way was better, hoping he'd get the message. And when he'd go behind my back to complain to the office manager, I'd defend my decisions in a way that left no room for doubt. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pleasant, but I stuck to my guns. Every time Andy came to me with his ideas for how things should be done, I'd shoot them down politely but firmly, providing clear, concise reasons for why my way was the more logical choice. But I knew something bigger was coming. The tension was escalating, and I could feel that Andy wasn't going to just let it slide. Fast forward a year, and things were finally clicking. The team was operating like a well-oiled machine, and we were about to launch 2 major websites that had been under development for months. The pressure was on for the big presentation to the board, and everyone was working hard to get the sites ready. But just when we thought everything was ready to go, disaster struck, a massive bug in the system right before the meeting. This bug wasn't just a minor issue, it was a major roadblock that would have crippled the functionality of the site. Imagine the pressure. It was the night before I had to present to the board, and here we were, scrambling to fix a problem that could ruin the whole project. I was in a hotel near the office while my senior developer, Johnny, was still at the office in London. We worked through the night to fix it, both of us running on fumes and racing against time. It felt like every minute we were losing would only make the situation worse. I'd never worked so hard in my life to get a project ready under such stressful conditions. There were moments when I thought we'd never pull it off, when I couldn't see a way forward. But Johnny kept pushing, and I kept trying new solutions. We finally came up with a fix. By 7 a.m., we patched up the site, got everything back in order, and were ready to roll. With just hours to go before the presentation, I could barely keep my eyes open, but I had to soldier on. This was make or break. It felt like I was walking into that boardroom with everything on the line, and let me tell you, the adrenaline was the only thing keeping me going. I was running on pure instinct, thinking of nothing but the finish line. Now, picture this, I walk into the boardroom, dead tired from no sleep, but determined to nail this presentation. The CEO, who I had met a few times and really respected, was the first to ask, "Are you okay?" I explained what happened, how Johnny and I had stayed up all night fixing the bug, and how we still managed to deliver the sites on time. Honestly, I was expecting a bit of criticism. But instead, everyone was impressed. The new sites were a hit. I had pushed myself, and Johnny, beyond what was expected, and it paid off. The CEO gave me the recognition I was hoping for, and at the end of the meeting, he pulled me aside to thank me for my hard work. He even told me to go home and rest. "It's a 3-hour train ride, you need sleep," he said. I thanked him, and then it was off to the train. Here's where the drama really kicks off. After a long train ride home, I was feeling pretty good, things were looking up. We had crushed the presentation, and my team was celebrating. To show my appreciation, I took the team out for lunch to thank them for their hard work. The office manager, riding the high of our successful presentation, decided to throw a huge office-wide celebration the following Friday. Everyone was pumped, after all, we had just knocked it out of the park. We started off at a fancy bar. And let me be honest, I'm more of a dive bar with a good beer kind of guy than the fancy cocktails type, but hey, I was in a good mood, so I rolled with it. We had a great time at the bar, and the mood was celebratory, everyone was joking around, congratulating each other, and it felt like we were all in this together. Then we moved on to a small club later in the evening. Now, I'm not much of a clubber, so after an hour or so, I said my goodbyes and decided to head home early. I had to catch a train back, and honestly, I was exhausted from the stress of the past few days. But everyone else was in full party mode, so I didn't think much of it. At that point, I had no idea that the night would come back to haunt me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I had no idea that this night would be the beginning of a conspiracy that would threaten everything I had worked so hard for. Monday morning rolls around, and I walk into the office. Something feels off. I immediately sense the tension. It's not the usual Monday morning energy, it's like something's brewing. I see people from HR walking around, and the usual chit-chat feels unusually quiet. It doesn't take long before I run into Emma, the content team lead. She looks just as confused as I feel. "Do you know what's going on?" I ask her. She shrugs, equally clueless. There's this strange, oppressive atmosphere hanging over the office, everyone's acting like they're walking on eggshells. Then, the bombshell drops, I'm called into a meeting with the office manager, HR, and the other team leads. The three of us, Emma, myself, and Andy, are squeezed into a tiny meeting room. It's so cramped that I can barely move without bumping into someone. The HR people are stone-faced, and the office manager looks like she's trying to hold everything together, but even she seems uneasy. And then HR drops the news. Mark, from the SEO team, has filed a formal complaint. He claims Johnny made racist comments at the club during the celebration. What? I'm floored. This wasn't like Johnny at all. I've worked with him for months, and there's no way he would do something like that. Johnny was the type to joke around, sure, but he would never cross that line. Both Emma and I are taken aback, but we keep our cool. We listen as HR explains that they'll be interviewing everyone who was at the club to get more details. But at this point, I'm already suspicious. I don't know why, but everything about Mark's accusation feels wrong. It doesn't add up. There were no witnesses. No one else heard anything. And yet, Andy is already pushing for Johnny's termination. He's adamant, we can't have someone like that in the office, he says. His tone is harsh, his eyes narrowing as he looks at Johnny like he's already guilty. At that moment, I could tell that this wasn't about what happened at the club. This was personal. Andy had been gunning for Johnny for months, and now he had his chance to get rid of him. I noticed how quickly Andy jumped on the bandwagon, wanting Johnny out without even questioning the lack of evidence. And yet, there was Mark, standing in the background, like he was the puppet master. I felt the anger start to build up inside me. I had been through enough with Andy to know that he didn't need much of an excuse to target someone who wasn't on his side. And Johnny? He had become an easy target for Andy to manipulate. But I wasn't going to let this happen without a fight. I didn't just sit idly by and let this unfold. I watched. I kept my eyes and ears open, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't let this go. I didn't tell Johnny what I had learned because I didn't want to cause any unnecessary drama, but I knew I couldn't just let Andy and Mark get away with this. They had conspired to take Johnny down, and I couldn't let them succeed. At first, I kept it to myself, gathering information quietly. I started to observe how Andy and Mark interacted more closely, looking for cracks in their story. I knew that if I was going to do something about this, I needed to be patient, methodical. And sure enough, one day, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. It was during one of my breaks when I went out for a smoke. The office was quiet, everyone working hard, and I decided to clear my head. I walked into the stairwell and saw Mark, of all people. He was on the phone, and as soon as he saw me, his face turned white as a sheet. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to walk in on him. He fumbled with his words, trying to change the subject, but I couldn't help overhearing enough to know that something was off. From what I could gather, he was talking to someone at a school. It sounded like he was asking for information about applying for a visa or maybe extending one. His voice was shaky, and there was a hint of panic as he spoke. He kept asking questions about paperwork and how quickly things could be processed. Something about it didn't sit right. The conversation seemed too urgent for a casual inquiry. I stood there for a moment, pretending to check my phone, letting him finish his conversation. As soon as he hung up, I walked by casually, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark had just said something he wasn't supposed to. This wasn't the kind of call someone would have if they were simply figuring out the next steps for a normal work visa. Something was up, and I had a bad feeling it was connected to the drama surrounding Johnny. A few days later, I was back up at the head office, and things were starting to feel even more tense. By that time, we had a new office manager who was stationed at the head office most of the time. I had just dropped my things off at the hotel across the street when I decided to swing by the office. I needed to have a word with the new office manager about something that had been bugging me. It had to do with the strange call I overheard Mark making in the stairwell. I didn't want to come across as paranoid or accusatory, but I felt like I needed to let someone know what was going on. I explained what I had overheard and suggested that perhaps the company might want to look into Mark's visa status. It was a delicate conversation, but I made sure to phrase it in a way that didn't raise alarms too early. The office manager seemed a bit skeptical at first, but after some discussion, he agreed to look into it. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming that nothing would come of it. But a week later, I got the shock of my life. Mark had stopped showing up to work. His absence was unusual, but I didn't know what to make of it until I got the full story. Word started to trickle out through the office grapevine, and I learned that Mark had been fired for not having the correct visa to work in the UK. Apparently, he had been working under his wife's student visa, and when her course ended, so did his right to stay in the country. The company wasn't willing to sponsor him for a new visa, and he was forced to leave. It was all falling into place. It wasn't just the visa situation that had me questioning everything, it was the fact that Mark had been trying to enroll in a fake school. The kind of scam that's all too common, where people use a college as a front for visa fraud. These places were tiny, barely an office, and they'd accept anyone willing to pay the tuition fee to get a student visa. Mark, desperate to stay in the UK and keep his job, had tried to go down this route. He had no other choice because, without a visa, he couldn't legally stay. I found out through some casual chit-chat around the office that Mark had been enrolled in one of these bogus colleges to keep his visa status intact. But he didn't have the money to pay for it, and with his application hanging in the balance, he had no choice but to leave the UK and go back to Dubai. When I found out the truth, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Mark had tried to use Johnny as a pawn in his scheme to take me down, and instead, he had set himself up for a much bigger fall. I pulled Johnny aside and filled him in on everything that had happened. He was absolutely stunned. He couldn't believe that Andy and Mark had been using him as a pawn in their game of office politics. He thanked me for sticking by him, but honestly, I felt guilty for not telling him sooner. But he wouldn't hear of it. Johnny told me that, despite everything, I had gone above and beyond to protect him, and he was grateful for that. As for Andy, well, about 2 months later, he handed in his resignation. No warning, no drama, just a quiet departure. He was gone from the company, and no one ever really heard from him again. It was like he vanished into thin air. No one had to tell me, I knew exactly what had happened. Andy had tried to take down both Johnny and me, but in the end, it was him who had been ousted. His ego had gotten the best of him, and he paid the price for it. Now, people have asked me if I feel guilty for what happened. Honestly, I feel bad that Johnny was caught up in all of this in the first place. He was an innocent bystander in a game of corporate chess. But as for Mark and Andy? No, you don't mess with my team. You don't target my people for your own gain, and you sure as hell don't play dirty without facing consequences. If they thought they could take me down and walk away unscathed, they were sorely mistaken. This was a game they were never going to win.